Before we start, is there any questions about anything from last lecture? About anything else? Nope. Okay. So your assignments will probably be another week being marked. So you can expect that in about a week. And assignment 2, I forget when it's due, but I'll give it to you, at least 2 weeks in advance, so you have time to do it. It will have to do with usability evaluation. So what we're talking about today is going to be the subject of that assignment. Okay, no questions? All right, so I'll tell you one more social engineering story, and then we'll move into what's called usability evaluation. So if I'm keeping track correctly, this is example number 4. All right. So this is a very, very similar story to the @Matt story that we talked about at the very end of last class. If you recall, he was someone, he had a Twitter handle, somebody wanted it. They were able to go around to different websites that he was involved with. Eventually, the sort of key trick that they used is Amazon wouldn't reset the password, but what they would do is they would allow him to enter a new credit card. So they didn't authenticate so heavily when it was just adding a new credit card. And then because he added a new credit card, he now knew one of the last 4 digits of one of the credit cards, the one that he added. And he was able to use that to basically prove that he was @Matt and then kind of backtrace through the different services, wiping out all his Apple stuff on the way back. So this one is similar. So I like it because it kind of is in the same vein, but it's also different. So the difference is what will be interesting. Okay, so it starts at the same basic idea. There was someone, and their Twitter handle was @N, so even shorter than @Matt, and the adversary wanted @N Twitter handle. And this person reported that they had been offered money in the past from people to buy it, and it was $50,000. So that's a sort of market value of it. At least that's a lower bound on how much it might be worth. Okay, so the process worked kind of the same. So the adversary, it started the same as the @Matt, sorry. So the adversary went to Twitter. They said, "Hi, I'm @N. I forgot my password." And we know the answer from Twitter. They say, "Okay, we have an email address on file for you, so we'll send a link to that email address. You just click on it, and then you can reset your password." By the way, just as an aside, how does that link actually work? So like I go and I'm like, I want to reset my password, and then I have some link, it ends up in my email address. I just click it and it knows who I am and it knows what email address it came from. Like how would you trace that through? Okay, so it could be with cookies. In this case it isn't, it's actually even simpler. Yeah, so what they'll do is they'll embed like a random value into the link itself. So when you go and you reset it, they say, okay, we're going to send it to, pulpspy@gmail.com. And what the website will do, Twitter will do, is they'll choose a random number. Okay. Now, if anyone else in the world has that link, they can reset my password. Okay. So it's important that that's not an exhaustive searchable number. Okay. You can't brute force it. So it's long, it's random. They drop an email to me with that link in it. And then when I click it, it sends get request, and they see that the get request includes that token as a response. And then they say, okay, well, I remember that this was sent to this address, and it's because this person was trying to reset their email, and so now I'll go ahead and reset it. So we'll see a little later with things like cross-site cross-site request forgeries and things like that, that passing these tokens around, you have to think through the security model of that. But anyways, so Twitter sends an email reset link. And in this case, @n had a personal email. So they weren't using Gmail or Apple Mail or anything like that. They had a personal domain. Okay, so at this point, the adversary's stuck. They don't have access to the email, so they can't click on it, so they can't take the Twitter password, reset the password for Twitter. Okay, so what do you do? What would you do now? You can't go to Gmail. If that was a Gmail address, you could go to Gmail and reset the password, and then try your luck there. Okay, but there's no reset for that because it's their own personal domain. Okay, so you want to steal the domain itself? Okay, so what we want to do is we want to figure out if this is a personal domain, he registered it somewhere. Okay, so where was it that he registered? And wherever that is, he has an account. And so we can try the password reset there. Okay, so there's something called Whois. It's basically like a kind of old protocol for looking up who owns domains and things like that. And a lot of it now is pseudonymized, so you don't get a lot when you go to it. But anyways, the adversary went to Whois. And they looked up domain.com. And they saw that it was registered with GoDaddy, which is a big domain registrar. Okay, now what are you doing?
You see, I think one of them we can see who's registered that domain, but these days I think we pay a little more and they don't show. But in this scenario,
Yeah.
you can see, for example, Farzad registered that domain. I have all the information.
Yeah, so you might have the personal information, even like add street address and name and things like that. Yeah.
And maybe again the credit.
Okay, so sorry, what was the very last bit?
The credit card.
Okay, the credit card won't be on Whois.
Yeah, if I have the credit card.
Okay, so if you had the credit card, so let's assume the adversary doesn't have the credit card.
You could try to contact GoDaddy and the support.
Sure. Okay, so you can go to GoDaddy and say, hi, I own this domain, I forgot my password. Okay, so that's GoDaddy's just a web service. It's nothing different than anything else. It has usernames, it has passwords. People forget passwords. We know that, and so there's a password reset mechanism. So that's what the adversary is going to do. So say I own domain.com. I lost my password. GoDaddy is one of the web services that has like a phone line. So they have a lot of business clients and things like that. So this is the kind of conversation that would happen over the phone. So you can put, as the adversary, they can put their social engineering tests, like tricks to the test, right? If they can get the person on the other end to really believe that they're that person, like they know all sorts of things about them or whatever the case may be, then if that person's able to reset the password, then they're able to reset the password. Okay, So what the person on the phone said is, great, we'll reset your password. I just need the last, in this case, 6 digits, which is a little weird. But I need the last 6 digits of your credit card number. Okay, so now the adversary's stuck. They don't know the digits of the credit card. They could do the Amazon trick. I think this attack happened after that, so Amazon probably closed that loophole. But they had the same idea, which is let's go, like lots of websites on the internet have the last 4 digits. And if I can get access to any account, then usually it will show you the last 4 digits, even if you're logged in. Like it usually will star out everything, but at least the last 4. Now we need the last 6, but let's just set that aside. Let's just go and try and get the last 4. So the adversary probably tried lots of different e-commerce sites and things like that. But anyways, the one that worked is they went to PayPal. And this was also a phone call. And I should note that you might be wondering, how do we know all these details? This person, just like in the app Matt story, eventually they started talking with the adversary, sort of negotiating what they're going to do. He could basically see the attack was happening kind of in slow motion. And so they started talking, and then you'll see they reached a sort of compromise at the end. But then the person told him, the attacker told him like all the things that the attacker did. So that's how we know like all of the different steps. So according to them, they called up PayPal, and they did just pure social engineering. So the pretext was that they didn't impersonate @N. Okay, what they did instead is they impersonated a PayPal employee from a different division. We don't know the details of what exactly they said, but they had some good reason why they needed the last 4 digits of that credit card. Maybe they asked for a lot of things, a file that had it in it, or I don't know. And they had some reason for why they didn't have it, or they didn't have access to it, or something like that. But you could imagine a lot of scenarios where that's the kind of information that maybe you would exchange behind the scenes. So the person obviously bought the pretext. This could also, they probably didn't just call like the customer support for PayPal. They maybe had like an inside number. So they called someone like a direct employee, their phone. I'm just speculating on the details of it, but that's the kind of thing that social engineering would give you. So you do your information gathering, so you would know who's the person at PayPal that I want to call that would be expecting a call like this, or is likely to give me the information that I need. You call them directly, and then now your pretext seems a lot more believable. You know a lot about the company and things like that. So anyways, we don't know all the details of what happened, but they did elicit, so this is elicitation, because you're asking for something, and they got the last 4 digits, but not the last 6. Okay, so now the adversary can go back to GoDaddy. Now, notice that they have the last 4 digits, right? So they don't know 2 of the digits. So that's the credit card number. Okay, so what do? So option 1 is you can just call them 100 times. Okay, what's your last 6? It's 00 whatever. Oh, sorry, that's wrong. Hang up. Right? Now you might think that's stupid because they'll catch on eventually, but customer services for, I don't know how big GoDaddy is, but they probably have lots of different agents, so it's not like you're going to get the same person every time, and you don't have to do it in one sitting, right? You can do it slowly over a month, over a couple weeks, whatever. You might try a couple each time, but yeah. Now, if they had some sophisticated tracking system on the back end, they might notice, oh, it's unusual, right, that somebody's trying to reset a password for this account. So if that information was getting logged, you could see how that might be a defense against this attack. But anyways, so that would be option one. Option two is they just called and they social engineered their way out of this situation. So I don't know, once again, we don't know the details of it, but they use social engineering. This time their pretext was that they were at N. And so they want to reset password. So it's persuasion in this case because you're asking them to do something for you. And so the customer support believed the pretext. So they might have said, I don't know, I had this credit card, but I lost it. I don't remember all the digits. I know the last 4 digits or something like that. Anyways, they believed it. They were just like, but I can't reset it unless if I know the 6. Like I literally, like the system won't allow me. And so what they did is they actually, the customer service agent basically exhaustive searched on their behalf. So they're like, well, let's just try 00, let's try 01. And then eventually they found it. So. Okay, so they were able to reset the password. Okay, so now they own the GoDaddy account, and because they own the GoDaddy account, they own the entire domain. Okay, so they can change the server if there's a website up. They can change the mail server, so they can reroute all email to them. So the adversary will log into GoDaddy, and then they can start changing DNS records. So like the A record is for a website. The MX record would be for the mail server, and there's other ones. Okay. Then what they could do is they could go back to Twitter and say, I lost my password. Now they control the email. So the email will come to them. They'll click on it, and then they'll recover it. Now what happened in this story is at this point, @N started getting emails about like their GoDaddy password being reset and things like that. So and @N caught on. Domain, I can't remember the exact story, but I think... or I know that domains sometimes take like 2-3 days for kind of it to percolate around the DNS system. So it's not instant. If you go in and you change the mail server, it's going to take a couple days. So @N knew it. They knew that this was coming, you know, in a couple days. And so they basically, they opened a communication channel with the adversary, maybe by emailing them at their own domain name. That's not consistent with what I just said. It's been a couple years since I read the actual article itself, so I forget exactly what happened. But anyways, they caught on. They started talking with the adversary somehow. and they basically negotiated that the adversary could have the Twitter handle. But give the domain back, because the problem with it is it's the adversary just wants it because they want that Twitter reset, right? But what's going to happen is all of the email that's going to this person is now disappeared, right? So if you're in that situation, and I think they called GoDaddy and there was some fix, but it was going to take like 30 days because they had to send in paperwork or something like that. And so basically there was no way out of it. They could see that they were going to lose their email. And so just imagine for yourself, like if your email just turned off for, in 3 days, your email is going to turn off for a couple of weeks, right? And there's nothing you can do, right? You can create a new email, but like lots of people are going to be sending you email and they're not going to know, and you can't remember every single person you ever emailed. And so it would be a disaster. So they just wanted to avoid it. Okay, so that's another example that shows just slightly different pretexts, a slightly different chain of events. It also demonstrates that it sort of reinforces an earlier point that we made when we were talking about SSL certificates, which is that DNS is really critical, right? If someone controls your DNS record, they can control your website, they can control your email, they can get certificates issued for your website, either because both because they control the website itself and also because they control email that would be sent to like admin@domain.com and that type of thing. Okay, so DNS is like something that when you're talking about web security, people don't always think about it, but it's really important. It's an important thing to make sure that you keep secure. Okay, so just to recap. All right, so if you're a company or a firm, what you want to do is you need to basically, it's really hard to protect against because it involves policies. There's no it's not like something technical that you can implement. So you have to implement it through policies. Policies have to get thought through. Different companies have different kinds of employees with different kinds of access to different things, different information or different authorizations. And so every company is sort of different. So it makes it really hard to say, okay, here's 100 steps, just follow them, and then you won't be vulnerable to social engineering. Okay, so it requires something that's like sort of custom for every company, depending on what they do and who has access to what. And it requires a lot of education, right? You have to get all of your employees, right? Not just the high-level executives, right? You need all your employees down to administrative assistants and everyone basically to be aware of the threats. Anyone that has an email account at your company needs to know about social engineering. All right, so you have to, so it's hard to protect against. You need custom policies, although there are some universal policies like never open attachments or things like that. But then those things can have trade-offs too, right? So like if you're never allowed to, you could disable, like IT could disable all attachments on email, right? But people have to send files around. So now how are they going to send files around, right? And they're probably, I don't know, they'll copy on a USB stick and go sticking it into other computers. Is that better, right? That might actually be worse. So you have to think about the usability as well. But anyways, you have custom policies, so they need to be reviewed and developed. You need education and training. All staff. You can also, like, to some extent, it works where you can, if there's something that's critical, what you can do is instead of giving one person authorization, you can make it so that 2 people or 3 people or 2 out of 3 people, whatever way you want, you need their cooperation basically to access something. So you can distribute or decentralize access control. You can hire a security firm to try and pen test you. So this would be the most extreme. So this isn't something that like small companies are going to do, but if you're a big corporation, then you might think about hiring a security firm to test for social engineering vulnerabilities. So if you read the textbook that I drew the material on for this lecture, The Art of Human Hacking, the person who wrote it, that's his job. And there's lots of stories in that book about, different things that they do and also like a lot of background on how they do it and things like that. So they'll just go into a company. No one will know, like the top level, like the CTO or someone, whoever hired them, they know that it's happening, but then no one else in the company knows it's happening. And they just, they go and they do everything that they can. Right, they talk to people, they send emails, whatever, and there's usually some ground rules and ethics and things like that, and and then they report back basically on what went wrong and what the company can do to fix it. And you should think hard about, like we just saw an example of DNS. So things like this, like sort of basic critical things, phones, SMS. So you've probably heard about like people stealing your SIM card, right? Or like basically they get your number somehow, right? And once someone has your number, well then all your 2-factor authentication is if you're using SMS, it's all getting routed to this other phone. And there's all sorts of things that you can do, in order to once you have control of someone's SIM card, email addresses, that kind of thing. In-person actions. How much power you give your customer support. Are they allowed to reset password, or do they have the authorization to do it? Right. Is there a screen in front of them and they can just type in the password if they want, or just press a button and reset it? Or is it, if your policy is that the person needs the last 6 credit digits of the credit card, does the customer support actually have to type that in and then the system allows them to reset the password? Right. So there's a difference between the customer service is supposed to ask for the last 6 digits, then they reset the password, or the system enforces it. Right. So in the first case, if they decide that they believe you, then they might reset it anyways, even though you don't know the exact last 6 digits. Okay. Questions about social engineering? Okay. All right, then we're going to do a hard reset, and we'll talk about a different topic. This topic is somewhat related to social engineering in the sense that it involves humans. This time we're going to go back to actual methodologies. So we're going to talk about how you do methodologies and evaluation. You recall from the evaluation framework that you had usability criteria. So you had usability, deployment, and security. So usability in the evaluation framework, it's just sort of you thinking through what the usability would look like. Okay? But what if you really want to know whether a system is usable or not? Or maybe you know, like it gets a bad mark because it requires people to remember long digits. But you're like, well, people probably can remember long digits, right? So like, how do you know like whether they can or not, or how many digits they can remember, or what percentage of users can remember how many digits, that type of thing. Okay, so if you really want to know about it, then what you can do is you can use one of three methodologies. There's more, but I'll show you the three main methodologies for testing out usability, and you'll get to try it out yourself on the assignment. Okay, so pretend you have a system or I'll just call it a solution because it's a little more vague. And you've looked at the solution from every aspect that you can think of from a technical perspective, and your conclusion is that this is secure. Okay, it's bulletproof in terms of security. The only problem with it is it's really hard for an average user to use. Okay, so let's say you deploy this solution. Let's say you're a company or something, you deploy this solution. What are the things that will go wrong? Okay, so the first thing is that users just might try their best not to use your system, right? So let's say it's like a secure communication for like sharing files with people in a secure way. They're going to find other ways of sharing files, right? They're going to email them, use Slack, whatever, USB sticks, whatever, print it out, mail it, I don't know. But if it's hard to use, they're just going to avoid using it, okay? So they could use something that's more insecure instead. They might try to use it, but because it's hard to use, they might make mistakes. And some of these mistakes might be critical. Okay, it might be even worse than if they hadn't used the security system in the first place. So that we'll call these dangerous errors. So for example, in SSL, we saw an example where you get a certificate and it's not valid. So what do? Well, you ask the user, right? Just the browsers are like, well, we don't know, like it doesn't meet the criteria, but maybe it's okay. We'll just ask the users. And so it'll say like, sorry, the certificate, blah, 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 blah. Do you want to accept it? You know, do you want to just click it and then the website will load as normal? Or do you want to ignore it and think that there's a security issue there? Okay, so if it's a hard to use system and that error message is full of jargon and users don't understand it, then they might start accepting certificates that are invalid. Okay, so that would be a dangerous error in this case. Now, as I mentioned, browsers have gotten way better at writing these. And so if you use a browser like Chrome, they've used the methodologies that we're going to describe in this lecture to test out their error messaging and what they allow you to override and what they don't, and the steps that you go through actually reduce dangerous errors. They reduce it to like negligible numbers. And there's lots of research from the team there that shows that. Another thing to keep in mind is that security is what we call a secondary goal. So you're never like, I really want to send an email and make sure it's secure. right? Like your first goal is just to send that email. Then security is a second consideration. It's a consideration, right? But you're not like, I'm going to go out and be secure. I want to go do something on my computer, but I want to be secure. I don't know. I don't care what it is. I just want to do something that's secure, right? People don't do that, right? They want to do something, and then the second thought is, well, let me do it in the most secure way as possible, okay? But there's always that overriding desire to just get done what you need to get done, especially if the security is starting to get in the way. So accomplishing a task is the first goal. The final thing is that maybe users do it the secure way at the start, okay? So there's a lot of warnings. Like I remember when, I don't know, software firewalls first came out. And so you would download it, you would put it on your computer, and every single website that you ever connected to, it's like, do you want to allow this or not allow it, right? And so you might like spend the first day like being very careful, allowing and not allowing, but then like after 2 days or a week or a month, you stop caring. Okay, and so security can be like that as well. So people might be really cautious the first time they use it. They might do everything right, but then eventually they just get kind of tired of it, right? They get tired of the warnings and they just get fatigued, and then they start clicking through things or ignoring it, the security advice, or using other systems instead. So just because a user does the right thing right away, you can't say, oh, that was a success from a security perspective. You have to think about it in terms of the long term. So users habituate to warnings and errors, and they get fatigued, tired of them. Okay, here's some other just sort of things to keep in mind before we drop down into the actual framework itself. So these are things that we learned from the literature on usability. Okay, a lot of systems or solutions come with defaults. So you know, the person designing it, they make a decision. They want to give the user control and flexibility so they can configure it any way they want, but you need to have a sort of set of defaults, right? And defaults matter. So what that default position is will absolutely dictate user behavior. Okay, so most users are not going to change the default. So to give you an example of it that has nothing to do with security, there was a study where people were looking at how many, this was in the US, and so they were looking at how many people volunteer to donate their organs if they happen to get in a car crash. Okay, and so this is something that you would register when you apply for your license, because it has to do with car crashes. It's coming from the the driver license. And so they noticed that in some states it was super high, in other states it was super low. And then they investigated further, and they saw that in the states where it was high, by default, you were an organ donor, but you could opt out. So if you did nothing, you just said, give me the driver's license, you'd be an organ donor, but you could still opt out, but you would have to actually do it. You'd have to click the box or fill out the form or whatever. And then in the flip side, the states that were low, by default, you weren't an organ donor, and then you would have to fill out a form or click a box or whatever it is, check a box or whatever to opt in to becoming an organ donor, okay? And so the people weren't that different. I mean, the people that lived in one state and the other state, they were the same. They probably felt the same about whether they would donate organs, but there was this huge noticeable gap because of defaults. But yeah. Yes?
by default you don't donate?
So I don't know what the common thing was, but as a result of that research, almost all states switched to, yeah, by default you do donate. Yeah. And then there was a whole bunch of other things like that. So there was this big movement called nudging. So there was a book called Nudge, and it was all about like how to set defaults for social policy. And it was more than defaults, but defaults was like one of the key concepts of that. And so different governments, like the UK government had a nudge unit. So they went out, the federal government under Tony Blair, like hired a bunch of people to just think about these kinds of things throughout all of government policies in order to just like not force people to do what the government wants, but just the idea is that you would nudge them. So you can always not do it, you can choose, but you give them that little nudge. And so I'm sure in Canada there was similar things, although I didn't hear it as decorated in Canada. Okay, security works best when it just happens in the background. It's automated. If you want to talk about software specifically, and so this was a field that was really cut its teeth on software, but you can apply it to all sorts of things that aren't software. But if you want to think about software, another thing you can think about, like for example, for defaults, right? They matter a lot. So now when I don't know, I buy a new phone, a new iPhone, when I first turn it on, it actually starts asking me some questions. Okay, it doesn't just choose my defaults for them. It's like, okay, do you want to send these error reports to Apple? Like you can enable it or not enable it, or do you want, and not all of those have to do with security or privacy, but there is an option for software designers to guide the user, right? So you have wizards and setup interfaces, and sometimes you use software and there's like little tips that start appearing and things like that. And so software can interact with the user to try and get them to understand what's happening. So it doesn't just have to be static, you install it, and then all the defaults are set, and then that's it. So I remember like when I was a kid, you would get, I don't know, Microsoft Word or whatever the equivalent was back then, and it would come with a manual. And the software wasn't set up to be useful. Like if you wanted to know how to do something fancy, there was some way of doing it, you would look it up in the manual. Okay? And so, yeah, and so that was just the modus operandi, RTFM, read the manual. And so that's what people used to say. So anyway, so that was software, right? Now it's like you never get a manual, right? Like that seems crazy. And so the software itself needs to guide you. So at least, the menu option should be obvious. There is a help that's kind of like a digital manual, and so it will try and help you with things. But now there's like machine learning, so you could like type in an actual kind of question, and it would try and find the most relevant thing to you as opposed to knowing the terminology of what to look up. So anyway, so there was a movement towards pushing software to be more like you learn how to use the software by just clicking on things, trying things out. If you click on the wrong thing, you can usually undo it, right? That kind of thing. And then taken to an extreme is like these sort of widgets or wizards that help you set things up and giving you feedback and tips and things like that. And then the last thing to remember is that developers aren't users. So the developer, whoever makes the software, it makes perfect sense to them. They can use it, right? But if you want to know whether actual users can use it, it's not good enough that the developers know how it works, right? They have a good mental model of how it works, and so you have to get real people that aren't developers in to test it out. Okay, so let's say that we want to test it out. There's sort of like, or we want to test the usability of something. So we'll use the example of software. I'll actually do it, like, I'll show you one of the methodologies. We'll do it for Tor, which is a privacy piece of software. But in general, there's 3 ways of doing it, and they're kind of similar, but there's some key differences as well. Okay, so the first thing you can do is what's called a user study. Basically, you grab people off the street, you pay them, you have them sit down and they use your software, and somehow you're going to try and measure whether it's useful or not. And so there's a lot of details there that we'll talk about over the course of the lecture. But in general, it's a user study. And so here you're getting a general population. Or you can choose like subsets, or you can control the demographics somehow. But anyway, actually, let me put this as who. Okay, user studies are good. They're a lot of work. They're expensive. You have to pay a lot and things like that. And then the other problem is that the people that you recruit for your study aren't necessarily the same as your actual population, or the people that will use the tools. Okay, so a more accurate, sort of the gold standard. So the best way of doing it that will give you the best results is called a field study. And this is where you would actually deploy your system for real, maybe to a subset of your users. So you might take your users and just randomly assign them. You see this with websites sometimes. You'll log in, and for half of the users, it will look different than the other half. And then they're testing between subjects, as it's called. So half of the people are using the new site, and half of them are using the old site, and they're doing some analytics or something like that. So field study, you actually push it to the real users. And so you get very accurate results as a result. Okay. The downside is, well, first off, it's hard. If you have an idea, it's hard to push it. It's hard to convince a company to push your idea. If you're the company itself and you've developed it internally, then that's fine. You want something that's super well polished. So sometimes you have some experimental designs. And so the user study is better there because you don't want to push your experimental designs to your actual employees because they're trying to get the work done. If it doesn't work, right, you're actually hurting the bottom line of the company because it's slowing them down or whatever the case may be. And so, yeah, with a field study, it's like when you're 99% sure that this is like good, then you can push it just to make sure. But when you're at the earlier stages, then something like a user study is a little bit better. And then the third thing you can do is, what if you don't want to run a user study or you don't have the means to run a field study? Could you not yourself just sort of sit down and try and figure out whether it's usable or not? And so the answer is yes. So this is, I'll call it an expert review. So a review by an expert. And the expert here doesn't mean an expert in the software itself. So if you're doing Tor, it's not experts at privacy, okay? It's an expert at usability, okay? So someone who knows usability. So it's a usability expert. Now, sometimes you want what we call a dual expert. So they're both an expert in usability and they're an expert in the domain that they're studying. But anyways, you need them to know about usability. So an expert review, and then, yeah, so then you can have one or two experts. Okay, and so we'll go through sort of how these different things work, what they look like, and the pros and cons of all of them. I'm presenting it kind of in a weird order. Normally, if you were to do this, you might start with an expert review first. Figure out all that you can figure out with an expert review. Then when you're pretty sure about what you have, then you could try a user study. And if the user study goes well, then you might try a field study. Okay, so that's sort of the progression. The reason I'm teaching it out of order is because I'm actually going to do an expert review, just a mini one. Like we'll spend whatever, half an hour or something doing it in class. And so I want to do it in the end, otherwise it will drag too much. So we'll talk about them slightly out of order of how you would actually do it. So we'll start with the user study, then we'll talk about a field study, and then we'll talk about the expert review. So the expert review is something that you could do. You aren't maybe a usability expert, but it's something that you could start trying to do. And so that's in assignment 2, I'll probably get you to try and do like an expert review of something for that assignment. Okay, so we'll go through these one by one, and I'll give you some sort of guidelines and things like that. So the first one is user studies. Okay, so we can think about the sort of pros and cons first. So the first pro is that unlike an expert review, you are getting sort of external people to test your software, okay? So the people, they're not developers, you're getting normal people to test it. Not developers or people who are really experts at using this kind of software, for example, or this kind of system. Okay, so the cons are that your normal people still aren't the same as the users as well. So they're maybe closer to your actual users, but they're not exactly the same as your actual users. Whereas in a field study, you're going to give it to your actual users. Okay. So how close your set of users in a user studies are to your actual users is something that you can control somewhat. Okay, so you can think about what your target user is, and then you can try and recruit people that match whatever that demographic is. Or you can recruit lots of people, but you can statistically weight. So the way someone uses it counts twice as much as someone else because they're closer to your target demographic or whatever the case may be. So this whole area is called representativeness. So how representative your sample is basically how close your participants are to your real users. So usually what you care about are things like knowledge, like how much do they know, what's their background, how much experience do they have. So it could be general IT experience if you're testing for software. It could be experience with a specific kind of software that you're testing. And so these are things that will make a huge difference. Someone's knowledge and expertise will make a huge difference in how they use your software. And so you want to get them as close to your actual users as possible. So it might be that your users don't have a lot of knowledge and experience, right? Then you want to run a user study with similar people. If you get people that with knowledge and experience, they come in, then you think, oh, this system is great, perfectly usable, but then you deploy it for real and no one can use it, right? But the opposite can be true too. So if you have really, if you're deploying a system for expert users, right, you can design it and sort of grind it down to where it's usable by the general population, but then your expert users might get frustrated with it, right? Because it's too slow or there's too many steps because you introduced a bunch of steps in order to bring an inexperienced user sort of along, right? And so It can go either way. So you want to match as close as possible your participants to your real users. Closely related but slightly different is what we call ecological validity. So if you do a user study, so for example, universities do them a lot, right? So researchers will do it. So what does that look like? It looks like, someone comes in, they come into the university. Sometimes they're university students already. Sometimes they're someone from outside the university. So they're coming in, they go to a lab, right? They sit there. There's someone like with a clipboard that's like talking to them, writing down like what they say and watching exactly what they do, right? And so that could change your behavior, right? If you're a user, especially pretend it's some sort of user study about security, you have to choose a password, right? And somehow you have an inclination that this is about security, and they ask you, create a password. They're looking at you like, recording notes, right? You're going to choose a good password probably, right? You want to please them or whatever the case may be. So there are tricks that you can do to try and disguise what you're actually testing in order to not, so this goes back to social engineering too. We talk about like preloading or framing things in people's minds. So if you preload the idea of security, then they might behave differently. But anyways, a lab environment is not the real world. Okay, and so the way people behave in a lab isn't necessarily the same that they would behave at work when no one's watching. So I'll say work or home environment. It's not, usability is not something that's just like a corporate thing where it's always about work and things like that. You can do usability of anything. Okay, so it's both the lab environment. It's the duration is usually pretty short. So you do a user study, you're in and out in 30 minutes. You're being observed constantly, so these are things that contribute to it, constant observation. Okay, other cons of a user study in general is that it's time consuming. So if you think about it, like let's say you want to bring users in and you want to spend half an hour with them. Okay, now I'll talk about it in a second, but you need to get enough users that you're actually sure that, like if you see a difference between, say you're testing an old system and a new system, right? And you think the new system is better. So you design a user study that's somehow going to test for it, and you start bringing people in. How many people do you need before you become like statistically certain that what you're seeing is real and not just like random noise, right? And so you might have to run 200 participants for that. That's a good kind of general number, okay? So 200 participants times an hour each or half an hour each, say half an hour each, so that's 100 hours, right? So that's a long time. Someone has to sit there in the lab, they have to do the study, and then there's the like pre-surveys and the like writing up the results after and all that kind of stuff, okay? So, that's just to measure something that you can measure in half an hour. You have to spend 100 hours doing that. So anyway, the time adds up. People cancel appointments and things like that, and so it takes months to do a user study. And then in a half an hour, what can you really test, right? So a half an hour isn't a long time. It's not like you get them to use it for a couple months and then they come back and tell you what they learned, right? You get them for half an hour, right? And so the other problem with the user study is that you can usually only measure very narrow tasks, a narrow set of tasks. Okay, so you want to be really certain of what you're doing before you go down. And people will do pilot studies and things like that and try and hone it, and they'll use expert review and things like that to try and, so they can tailor their user study so that they know exactly what they're looking for. and they can fit it into an hour or half an hour, and they know that if the result comes through, it's robust. And but anyways, there's a lot of effort that goes in. It's not something that you're just like, oh, let's just do a user study for the fun of it. Or you could do that, but you waste a lot of money. They're expensive because you're paying your participants, and as well as time consuming. So I'll say moderately expensive, because a field test might be more expensive, depending. If you want to push a whole system at scale, that could be very expensive as well. But it's definitely expensive for the amount of time that you're getting out. Okay, so how do you run a user study? What's the actual methodology? Okay, so the first step is something that you probably would never think of until you start doing these things. But especially in a university environment, hopefully even in a corporate environment as well, before you ever do a user study, you need to get ethics clearance. Okay, so you have to go to the university, and they have a special board, and you have to tell them what you're going to do. So anytime you do research that involves other human participants, you have to do this. So if anyone loves this lecture and says, I want to do a class project and run a user study for it, that would be a great class project, but you're not going to, you would have to get ethics clearance, and it usually takes a month and stuff like that, so it's too late for that kind of thing. You could do an expert review, but anyways, so the step one is to get ethics clearance. So this is true of any study with human participants. Now, if you're at Concordia, let's say you're on the flip side, you're on the ethics boards, most of the stuff you're reviewing is like someone has an experimental drug and they want to do a trial and, give it to a bunch of people, right? And so that's like a lot of hard work if you're, to think through the issues and the pros and cons of that. If you just say, I want some people to use some software and see whether they can use it or not, right? There's not usually ethical issues, okay? But there could be. So there's things that you don't always think of. So one thing is that you're going to collect a lot of demographic information, so personal information. And so you have to think through, what are you going to do with that information? Who has access to it? You maybe have a team of people that are doing it. Do they all get everyone's name and address of all the users in your study? How do you protect it? Do you delete it when you're done? What do you, so handling personal information is one thing that you have to think about. Some studies use deception. So you might lie to someone, and this is where you need ethics review to make sure that you're doing it in a way. So there's certain guidelines, like you have to always tell them the true nature of the study and things like that. So a lot of studies will use at least a light form of deception where they'll say, oh, like this is a user study about this, but it's really about security, because you don't want to preload that idea of security in people's minds. So you're going to be like, oh, this is a web study for seeing how easy it is to set up websites or something like that. But you're really testing for how people behave in a secure manner. So so it could be mild deception. I've seen user studies. There was a paper that somehow got accepted to a conference, a very prestigious conference, where they, I forget what they were actually studying. They wanted to stress people out. So they got someone to use a computer and type really fast, but they told them, don't ever hit this one key. And then they got typing so fast that they almost invariably hit it. And then they had faked it so that the whole computer got wiped out. And then the lab person started yelling at them, I just lost my entire thesis work. and things like that. And then now that they were really stressed out, they got them to do something else. And that's actually what they were testing. So they were testing for whether your response under stress was different than your response when you weren't stressed. But anyways, that to me was like highly unethical to start yelling at someone, even if you tell them at the end, oh, by the way, that was like just like part of the study. You could like, anyways, whatever. This is what ethic boards are for. I'm not on the ethics board, so I don't know what you can or can't do. But anyways, so deception is another thing. And then sometimes you do things like there's a lecture. I used to do a lecture on ethics, but we always run out of time. And so it's always the lecture that gets dropped. But there were like measurement studies where like internet measurement studies. So let's say, for example, I want to know, well, okay, this isn't the exact example, but I'll give it to you as an example. We talked about SSL, right? So let's say I want to know what SSL certificates are being used, okay? But I also know that servers might use a different certificate depending on where you are in the world, okay? So if you're in China, if you're in Iran, different countries have tight control over their internet. You might see a different certificate, or there might be something different about what the web looks like in a country like that as opposed to a country like, say, the United States, right? So then what you could do is you could get volunteers around the world, and they would install something on their phone, and basically you would use their phone just like a device. So you would connect to 100 different websites, and then you would measure what you see. Okay, and then you would compare it based on what location it is, and then you can try and draw some conclusions about censorship resistance and things like that. Now, the problem is when the person agrees, they consent to installing this, but they don't understand what you're doing. And so if you're going and you're looking at, like, say it's a controversial topic, right? And the way that that might be presented is something that a repressive government might try to suppress, right? But imagine you're a participant in the user study, you just install this thing on your phone, you don't know what's going on, but all of a sudden your phone tries to visit all of these like controversial websites, right? Now you're worried about, whether the police are going to come and, want to know why you're looking up, things about different security incidents or national incidents that are suppressed in like different countries and things like that, okay? So that's a sort of ethical consideration. So even though it, you're just doing an internet measurement study, you have to think about your users. Are you, jeopardizing their security by having them run your software to test things and things like that? So anyway, that's just another example of where ethics might come into play. Okay, the next thing you would do is you would recruit your users. So assuming that you got ethics clearance. Okay, so how you advertise, you have to advertise that you have a user study, right? And how you advertise is going to dictate who shows up. So how you... So if I put posters around campus, I'll get a lot of students. Okay, students look a certain way, right? If you're at Concordia, you went through the whole pandemic, you're really good at using Zoom and like all that kind of stuff, right? So if I have some user study about like whether you can do remote collaboration well, right? Then probably lots of you're better than the average person, right? If I pull some random person off the street, they're going to look a lot different than how you look as students, right? You tend to, have a certain age. There's lots of like demographics that make you a unique subset. And there are lots and lots of user studies that students are the main population because they're run through universities and it's the easiest to recruit. Some universities, they actually spend years getting lists and putting them together, and they have like people in the general community, and once they get someone that's agreed to be like a user in one of the studies, then they sort of add them to the list and they keep asking them. So they have their sort of gold star like users that will come in like once a month or something like that. And they don't represent the typical like kind of person that you would get, or they'd be hard to get if you were in a university. Let's put it that way. So anyways, another thing you can do is you can just go online. So there's websites like mturk, Cloudflower, and you can pay people to do small tasks. And so one of the tasks you could pay someone to do is a user study if you can conduct the entire user study remotely. So you don't need them to come in person. You're just going to pay them, you know, and sometimes it's small amounts, like you might pay them $5 or something like that, you know, for half an hour, and they'll do whatever they can do, but they have to be able to do it from their computer. Okay. Then there have been some studies that look at what are the demographics of Mechanical Turk users. And so there's a whole study of that. And so you kind of know what they look like, and then you can compare them to what your target users is, and then try and, you know, adjust to whatever extent you can statistically to match them up. Then it's easy to get 200 people, right? You want 200, you want 2,000, you can get 2,000. You want 10,000, maybe that's stretching a bit, but you can do a user study with 2,000 users. It won't cost you as much as bringing them into the lab. It won't cost you in terms of time. There is the time of setting your experiment up so it can work in an online setting, but you know, they can all do it in parallel. It's not like someone has to sit one by one with 200 people and spend 100 hours doing that. So yeah, if you can coax your study into that format, that can be a good option. Okay, so now you have your users. Usually what you do before you just drop them into the user study, you want to know who they are, what their demographics are, what's their expertise, and things like that. So usually what you do is you give them a questionnaire to fill out first. So you can ask them demographical information, you know, their knowledge, experience, that kind of thing. Then what you can do is you can screen participants, just a fancy way of saying drop them. So if they don't match what you're looking for, you can drop them from the study before they actually get into the study. And you can also do statistical weighting. This is maybe something more, this is what you do with the result of the study, but you can yeah, make some people's responses count more or less than others depending on how close they are to your demographic and how different they are from the other people in your group. Then usually you pay users. And it's really important that you pay them regardless of whether they finish the study or not. Otherwise, they have an incentive to finish the study. So you want people, if people want to drop out, you just want them to go. Otherwise, you're going to get bad data from them because they don't want to be there and they're just doing it to get paid. Okay? So usually they're paid up front, and it doesn't matter. You can leave at any time once you make it. Sometimes you pay them just to do the questionnaire. Usually you pay them for the, yeah. And you pay them before they actually do the study, so they don't think, oh, the person wants me to, they're looking for they want me to say their software is good, right? I'm going to say their software is good because I want to get paid, right? So you make it very clear that they're going to get paid regardless. Okay, so this is all the like work that you do before, and now you're ready to do the actual study. Okay, so before we started, I suggested the idea of a user study. You might think, oh, just grab some users, drop them into the user study. But as you can see, there's a lot of preparation. And this doesn't even include like designing the study and, you know, maybe trying it out and making sure that what you're studying is meaningful and things like that. But anyways, there's a lot of legwork that goes in before you do the actual study. Okay, so we'll drill down into the actual study next, but let's take a break. So come back around 12 after 7. Okay, so now you're ready to do the actual study. You need to design your study carefully. You generally only have, like I said, 30 minutes, maybe 60 minutes with someone. There's all sorts of studies. I'm not going to, like, I want to spend 5 minutes talking about this, not like a whole class. So there's many, many different kinds of studies. But the one that we see probably the most often when it comes to security is some sort of comparative study. So you have some system that's in use, you have some new improved version, and you want to just compare the two. So let me just use that as an example. So common type. So we'll assume for simplicity that you just have two systems, A and B. So it might be like A is the old system and B is the new system. So that's one kind of study. Another is that it's different configurations of the same system. So this is... So you're trying to figure out, maybe you're trying to set defaults and you want to figure out, okay, what default should I set? Then you might run your study with one default and then another's. And I'm having trouble typing. Okay, so configuration. It might also be both, like you might study 3 systems. You might study the old system, new system, like version 1, new system with a different version or whatever the case may be. Now, the best design that you can do, there are other ways of doing it, but this is by far the best. And if you're starting out, it's what you should do, is called between subjects. Basically, what you do is you flip a coin and you assign every user to either Group A or Group B. Group A only uses System A and Group B only uses System B. So half your users use one, a random half, and the other half use the other system. Now, sometimes, if you have like a really small set of users and there's like two people in your group that are like close to your statistically representative class, your target users, and you want to make sure that one of them is using system A and one of them is using system B. You don't want to risk that both of them use system A and then you don't have anyone that uses system B that has that expertise or something like that. Maybe you don't randomly assign. Okay, so but generally speaking, you should have enough numbers so that if you randomly assign things, that you get representativeness on both sides of your two groups. And the solution really isn't to go in and start tweaking with it. The solution is to run more users, but not every now and then you just can't do that for some reason. Or sometimes the data is already collected and there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to use the data that was collected or see what you can learn from the data that was collected. But yeah, anyways, generally you want to randomly use it. Okay, what's the problem if you get people if you're getting someone in, you're paying them to come off the street, they're coming in for half an hour. Let's say they have time to actually use system A and system B. You can learn a lot more by getting them to use both system A and system B, right? Because you can get like twice as much sort of knowledge out of the person, right? So what's the problem with saying, okay, use system A and then when they're done, then use system B? The problem with it is when they use system A, they learn something about like that general class of system and they bring that knowledge into system B. Okay, so it's going to corrupt sort of their knowledge. They're not a fresh user who's never used a system of this kind. So we call that the learnability effect. So if you go through a user study once, the second time around you at least learn something. And it's really hard to say that, oh, they didn't learn anything, or you can't put numbers on how much they learned or not. So it's better to just avoid it entirely. Now, sometimes you might, if you were to put them through system A and system B, you could at least randomize the order. So some do system A before B and some do B before A. Now, that if you were just doing a strict comparison between A and B, you might be able to use data like that. But if you're trying to draw conclusions about like more than just a simple comparison between the two, then the learnability effect like still biases your results. So anyways, it's better to just have a between subjects design and have lots and lots of users. Okay, that's the solution to most of the problems that you might have. Okay, when you're done with your study, you're going to do some analysis. Okay, so the first thing you do is you think about, you have to think about what you're trying to measure, okay? And the formal way statistically that you do it is you form what's called a hypothesis. So your hypothesis is that like system B is better than system A, or it's usually more detailed than that, but that is sort of your hypothesis. So you just write it down, make it explicit, and then you're going to try and determine mathematically whether that hypothesis is true or that hypothesis is false. So you formalize and you don't have to guess right. Your job isn't to guess the hypothesis right, because if it's wrong, then you're going to measure it as being in the opposite direction, and that's just as good as whether it's right or not. So usually people don't spend a lot of time on which side of the hypothesis they take. It's just called the null hypothesis. You just whatever's the easiest to articulate. And then you want to prove or disprove the hypothesis statistically. Which is a fancy way of saying that it's unlikely that your results are due to chance. right? So maybe by pure luck, all the people that can use the system end up in one group and all the other people end up in another group, right? And there's nothing about the system is different. Maybe you do a user study where you test the same system in both settings, but you still get a result that looks like system A is better than system B, even though system A and B are the same. So that stuff can happen by chance, right? But it becomes more unlikely. And the more participants you run, the more likely it is that you get the same level of domain expertise and things like that. Whatever's causing the system to be more usable by one person than the other, you're more likely to get them on both sides of your division of subjects. Okay. So the more users you run, the more confident you get that any difference that you're seeing between the two systems is actually due to an actual difference between the two systems, as opposed to just luck of certain users being assigned to group A and certain users being assigned to group B. Okay, now we're talking about numbers and statistics and things like that. The statistics, first off, are really hard, so I'm not going to go through all the details. I'm not even a real good expert in all the different statistical tests and things like that. So usability people need to know a lot about statistics and how to reweight things and all sorts of stuff. It's a whole amount of expertise in and of itself. But one basic problem you have is how do you so statistics require numbers, right? So how do you turn, I can use system A better than system B into numbers, right? Now, if you're doing security things, maybe you can measure the number of times someone makes an error. So you can put a number on that, right? So you can say, people in this group, they made errors on average 3 times per user. In this group, they made 5 errors or something like that. So sometimes you want to measure, your hypothesis is system B reduces the number of errors. So that's a quantitative hypothesis. It can be measured with numbers, but a lot of times you also have qualitative things that you want to know. You want to know something that's not a number, like is this more usable or something that's a little more vague. Okay, so some hypotheses. Okay, so quantitative meaning numbers and other ones are qualitative. So how do you turn people's feelings about something into numbers? All right, and you know the answer to this because you've done it a million times in your life, even if you, does anyone know the answer, by the way? Okay, so what you do is you ask questions. So anyways, if you have qualitative, you're going to do it by asking questions, okay? And you're going to ask the questions on what's called a Likert scale. Anyone now know what I'm talking about? Okay, I guarantee you everyone in this room has used the Likert scale, even if you don't know what the name of it is. All right, so there'll be some question. It'll be kind of like, okay, system A is more secure than system B. And you'll be like, I strongly agree or I strongly disagree. Neutral in the middle, whatever, right? Everyone's used them? Okay, so why are they so popular? Right? Like why do people always ask? Like they could just ask you, describe your experiences using the software, and then you can write whatever you want. Right? So surely that's giving them more information because you're not limited by the questions that they're asking. The reason they're doing this is because they want to turn your feelings about something into numbers. And then they're going to look and they're going to see, okay, in system A, is that number, that average number that comes out, is it stronger than the average number that comes out in system B. And can I say that that difference is so big that it can't be due to chance, right? That it must be due to people at least feeling like they more strongly disagree or agree with the statement in group B as opposed to group A. Now, Likert scales have all sorts of problems in and of themselves. So just some general guidelines when you use them. Shorter is better. Because you want to avoid user fatigue. Okay, what happens when you get sick of doing it? Okay. So first off, the most charitable thing you might do is just stop filling it out. Okay, then you can at least deal with that. Okay, but then what you do is you're just like strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree, all the way down, or random, like just asking things. Okay. Now, is there something you can? First off, is there something you can do in terms of people quitting? What you can do if you have a problem where people are quitting halfway through, you can still use their answers up until when they quit, right? The problem is you're going to have lots of answers for questions 1 to 20 and not a lot from 20 to 40 or whatever. So what you can do is you can at least randomize the questions so everyone gets them in a different order. And then if people are quitting early, then whatever, you get the same coverage of all the questions. So you want to randomize the order of the questions. Also, people will probably think really hard about the first question you ask them, and they're not going to think so hard about the 40th, right? So you want to make sure that every question has a chance to be in somebody's first response. So that's another reason to reorder it. So even though people get fatigued, they might do something like quit, or they might answer randomly or whatever. But the other thing they might do is they might still answer the questions, but they're just not thinking as hard, or they're kind of giving up and they're tired of it. And so they're not putting as much thought into it. Okay, so randomize the order of the questions. Now, what if people are just like, I agree, I agree, I agree, I agree? Can you do something about that? Okay, so you could like look and see like statistically if you see some weird streak of I agrees. So that could be one thing. That's usually not done because you don't know for sure, right? So it looks suspicious, but maybe they actually agree with all of them. Is there anything else you can do?
You could also check how long it took them to complete the survey.
Okay, so you could look at some statistics like that. So that might be a way, and that would be a good reason to drop people from the study. Another thing you can do is you can ask the same question twice, but you flip sort of the response. So like, do you think system A is better than system B? They'll say, I strongly agree. And then later, somewhere buried in the middle, you say, do you think system B is better than system A? And if they strongly agreed with the first statement, they should strongly disagree with the second statement. Okay, so if you actually take questionnaires, you'll probably notice this, that you'll be like, oh, didn't they just already ask me that? You know, sometimes they ask you the same question. That's why they're doing it. And so they want to see that you're always answering consistently, and sometimes they'll flip it around, so you have to flip your response. So these are called consistency checks. Sorry, for the exam? 6120. You sorry, they had consistency tests on the exam. Oh yeah, got it. It's good. I don't. Who taught that? Manon? Yeah. Okay. Good. He writes the best exams. You could have taken this course with him if you took it last year. Okay, so consistency check, you're going to ask the same question more than once. Usually not literally the same question, but it's usually rephrased. And sometimes you invert the question, meaning that you make it so that the one question they would answer strongly agree, and the other they would have to answer I strongly disagree. Okay, so this is good. So now you have some quantitative data, like how many errors they made. You have qualitative data. You've turned it into a Likert scale, and so now you have numbers for everything. And so you have Group A, and they have one set of numbers, and you have Group B, and they have a set of numbers. And so now what you want to do is you want to do some statistical tests to see whether the differences between Group A and B are, to use the fancy term, statistically significant. Okay, so as noted, this requires statistical expertise. I'm not an expert in it, so I'm just sort of telling you at a high level what your experience will be, not the actual tests that you use and things like that. And this should have something to do with your hypothesis. So at the end of the day, you're trying to prove or disprove your hypothesis. So your hypothesis is that there is a difference between A and B in terms of whatever, like A is easier to use than B or something like that. So you frame your hypothesis in terms of a difference between A and B. You do your study, and then either A and B look exactly the same, you can't tell the difference, or there is a difference there, okay? Then the question becomes, okay, there's a difference. Is it just due to chance? Or is it probably, you can never know for sure, right? But is it more likely due to like an actual difference as opposed to just random chance? And so a result becomes statistically significant, and there's a whole definition of exactly what it means and what percentages of things. But at a very high level, it just means that it's very unlikely due to chance. Okay, so it's very likely due to an actual real result. Now, there's different ways of gaming the system. Like you could try different hypotheses until you find one that's significant. And so you sometimes you hear about things like p-value hacking and different things that researchers do. Sometimes it's problematic because you want to get a good publication, and if you have good results, you get a good publication. And so people or they'll move people between groups and things like that until they get that result that they're looking for. And so sometimes people are engineering statistical significance rather than letting it just come out naturally. And then the way to combat that is you can have people reproduce your studies. So you're telling me something, then I'm going to run my study with my users and see if I get the same result. And so anyways, yeah. When you read news articles and they're like, especially in the medical field, it's like, oh, this causes cancer, or like this is correlated to this or whatever. You have to always be a little bit careful because the things that grab the news headlines, sometimes, yeah, they're the big juicy stories, but a lot of those actually historically we've seen fall apart over time as people try to replicate them. Okay, so it requires some statistical expertise. And so significance means, I'm just going to shuffle this around. Okay. So significant basically means unlikely that differences are due to random chance. So people talk about p-values, that's what they're talking about. And okay, the main question, just even if you don't do the statistics, one thing you'd like to know is like how many users sort of roughly would it take to get statistical significance? And so it's going to depend on how strong the effect is. If it's very subtle between them, then you're going to have to run a lot of users to be sure that that effect is real. And if there's a really strong effect, then you don't have to run as many users before you start seeing that, oh, this effect it's so obvious and apparent, you can see it even though you've only run a few users through the study. So just as like really high level advice, just to give you like an idea of the numbers, about 200 participants is good for most things that you might want to measure. So this would be for your kind of average difference between the groups. And if you had something that was really, really obvious, you might be able to get away with like something like 20 participants. So when I read the security literature, like lots of people do these tests, they write the results up and things like that. I often see studies with like 40 people. Like that's pretty common, especially if it's an in-person study, you're bringing people in off the street to do a user study, then something around 40. If you do 200, that's really good. That's considered, I think it's considered a very strong result. And if you do some sort of mechanical automatic thing where you have internet users, then you might use 1,000 or 2,000 people or something like that. But if you're doing an actual user study where you're bringing humans in, usually, people don't go beyond 40, probably because it gets too expensive. But if you saw 200, you'd probably be very confident in the results. Okay, so that's user studies. The next thing you might do is a field study. So if we go back, just recall that there's 3 types of studies. So the user studies with the general population. Now we're talking about a field study. So this is where you're going to deploy it to your actual users. I won't spend as much time talking about it. But the idea here is that you deploy so a common way of doing this is called A/B testing, which is just like in the user study, you divide your users into 2 groups. So for example, A gets the solution and B doesn't get it. And then you're basically going to do all the same stuff you do in your user study. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of a field study? Okay, so the big pro is that it's representative. You get a good sample. The people are exactly the people that are going to use your system anyways, and so you get strong representativeness. Because people are using it for real, like say it's in a corporate environment, they're actually using it in terms of doing their job. You're not bringing them into the lab, watching them with a clipboard. You just push the tool, they have it, they're doing their day-to-day stuff. They're doing it the same place that they normally work. They're just using your tool as opposed to not using it. So you have strong ecological validity. You can have a large user base. Usually it doesn't matter. Like once you do all the work to set up your field study, it doesn't matter if you push it to 10 people, 200 people, or 2,000 people. That's the number of people that are going to use it. Unlike a user study, whereas every additional person is another 30 minutes of your time and another $200 that you have to pay them or whatever. So yeah, you can have a large user base and it's sort of like, it doesn't matter how big it is. Another thing you can do is in a user study, you have about 30 minutes with someone. In a field study, you can make them use this tool for 3 months. So you have a longer time period. Then you can start looking at fatigue. Does the user fatigue after a while and things like that. So you can see if they acclimatize to the tool, if they get fatigued of it, that kind of thing. So there is a difference between, yes, like people have a high tolerance for 30 minutes of something. It can also be more extreme than that. Like, here's an example that has nothing to do with security. Okay, so everyone knows Coca-Cola, the drink. There's Pepsi, so they're competitors. So I forget when it was. Let's say it was in the 80s. What Pepsi started doing is they would go into supermarkets, and Pepsi's like a little sweeter than Coke, or at least in the 80s it was. It tastes different. It has a different taste profile. So what Pepsi realized is we're going to go into supermarkets and we're going to give people what they call the Pepsi challenge, where they give them 2 cups, one's Coke, one's Pepsi, but they're not labeled, and they challenge them to see which one tastes better. And then at the end, more people prefer Pepsi than to Coke, even if they're Coke drinkers, because in that small little time window, you're just having a sip, the sweetness or whatever, it tastes better to people. Then Coke got really mad about it. And so what they decided to do is reformulate Coke. So it used to be called Coca-Cola Classic, and then they came out with what was called the New Coke. And so the New Coke, they spent a long time doing user studies. So they bring people in the lab, they would try different recipes, and eventually they got something that would beat Pepsi. So most people would if you do the Pepsi challenge with this New Coke, they're going to like the New Coke better than Pepsi. Okay? So then they thought they won the Cola Wars. So they brought out this New Coke, they rolled it out, and they started doing the Coke challenge, right, in grocery stores, and people like New Coke. Now, the problem with New Coke is it actually tasted good, apparently, if you have a sip of it. But once you have a can of it or you have a case of it, it starts to get kind of syrupy, and it's too sweet, and it's kind of citrusy, and it's gross. And so people, after a month, hated it, right? Everyone wanted the original Coke coming back, okay? So the lesson there was because you had like a small sample, what you like is going to be different than if you're drinking it every day, right? And so software is kind of like that. If you might have like some really high usability features where like the software is really going to hold your hand and make sure that it walks you through. And you might love that at first, right? Because it's making your life easier. But after a month of it, you get really irritated with it, right? Like there was one thing that was much maligned, once again, not about security, but at least about software, is Microsoft Word had this like thing called Clippy. I don't know if anyone remembers, but it's a paperclip animation. It would show up in the bottom right of your Word document, and it would talk to you as you were trying to write your document. Like, oh, hey, like, do you want to make that bold? Like, I can help you with that, or I don't know what all it would say. And so anyways, that's the kind of thing that actually is a really good idea, right? It's there. It's going to help the user. They don't have to read the manual. They don't have to go through help looking through things. But over time, it gets a little irritating, right? And once you know Word and you know what you're doing, then it's just in the way. It's kind of dancing around, and you just want to get rid of it, okay? So people's attitudes change over time. So if you can do some sort of longevity study, then yeah, you might get a very different response after 3 months of someone using something than after 30 minutes of using something. So a field study is a really good way to get that longevity. The other thing you can do is in 30 minutes, you can only look at like a narrow set of tasks. But with a field study, you're going to let them use it for 3 months. You can see how they use it in lots of different dimensions. So you can examine a broader set of hypotheses. Okay, so this sounds great. It actually is great. Like it's strict. It's in terms of actual like usability properties, it is better than a user study in all regards. Okay, the only con really of it is just that it's hard to arrange. Okay, it's expensive and things like that. So so logistically, it's hard. You have to get it polished enough that people are willing to push it. You also have to instrument it, so whatever your data you're collecting, it has to phone home with that data. You might have to, even though some of your users are going to use the current system, it might not be collecting data. So you have to instrument the current system too so that it's collecting data, and then all this data is flowing back to you. So it's logistically hard. It needs to be instrumented. For data collection. Yeah, it needs to be a highly polished solution. So if you have some crazy idea and you just want to test whether it works with users, you can't use a field study for that. And so yeah, you have to convince a company to do it if you're a researcher or something like that. So one study that I really liked, actually some colleagues at Polytechnique here in Montreal, they did it. They actually gave people laptops. Actually, it was a collaboration, I guess, between them and Carleton. But they had a study where they would just give someone a brand new laptop. And so they were able to fund it, but then they did some instrumentation of the laptop. And so they were able to collect a lot of data about like how often do they get malware infections and things like that, and how did they do it. And the other thing, going back to the ethics clearance, you have to think about privacy. So you're giving someone a laptop, but as researchers, you don't want to know everything that they're doing on the internet. And so you need to, have some like privacy built in. So you're collecting some kinds of data, but you're not collecting everything. Maybe you anonymize it. And then where does the data end up? Who holds it? So these are all the issues that they had to think through. And it was just like a large scale project because normally you don't have the money to give everyone a laptop. But they were able to do it. And so, yeah, that was a nice paper. Maybe I'll link to it on the course website if you want to read it. But anyways, okay, so that's field studies. Then we'll talk about expert review. Okay, so before I said it's a usability expert, actually what we prefer is what we call a dual expert, meaning they are an expert in usability and they know something about the system. Or solution, I guess is the term that we're using, being tested. So an expert review, you don't just pick a random person off the street. Okay, this is like before you do your user study, before you do your field study, you want to just get a sense of what the software is about. You get someone who knows a lot about usability. They know how to do a formal usability analysis, but they also know enough about the software that they know that, oh, this might be a problem, right? This looks like there's a chance the user is going to click on this, and I know what that will do. I know that that leads to a dangerous error. or whatever the case may be. So you have to know enough about the system to know that that's something that needs to get flagged if you're going to flag it. Okay, so that's why we look for dual experts. Okay, so the pros and cons. So it could be cheap, usually cheap because you're only paying one person to do it. Now, because they're an expert, maybe you're paying them a lot, but it's probably cheaper than paying 200 people in a user study, and it's probably much cheaper than running a whole field study. It's very fast. You don't have to do a lot of preparation. You can just do it. In fact, we'll do it probably next class, but we'll just do it off the top of our heads or whatever. So it's you can do it right away. You can look at a broader set of issues than you could in a field or in a user study. So in user study, you have that 30-minute window. Expert review. First off, because you're an expert, you can go through the system a lot faster than someone off the street can do. And then you're not limited to 30 minutes. You can say it for 4 hours or 5 hours or whatever it takes. So you can cover more of the system or solution in greater depth. Than a user study. So in a field study, you could maybe do it comparably because you have a couple months or whatever, but especially relative to a user study, this is kind of like your rapid prototyping where you do it. The main drawback is that the expert isn't a real user, basically by definition. So they're going to make errors. So there's two types of errors, and basically false positives, false negatives. So they could miss things that real users, miss problems that a real user would have. Or on the opposite side, they might flag too many issues. There might be a whole bunch of issues that they flag that aren't actually really issues. Now, generally, that's not a problem. You can fix everything, but it takes time, right? And so if they're flagging a whole bunch of stuff and it's not actual problems for your real users, then you waste a lot of time and money fixing things that didn't need to be fixed. So I'll put issues in quotes, so too many issues that aren't really problems. And so this leads to time and money to fix. Okay. So there's two main kinds of expert reviews. There's probably lots, but the two main ones, one of them's kind of fallen out of favor, but the one that we'll study is called a cognitive walkthrough. Yeah.
What is the typical education of an expert reviewer?
Sorry, what's the
typical education of an expert reviewer? Would they just already be in the field and then just be interested about usability?
Yeah, so I guess it depends where they're coming from. So if it's a company corporate setting, it would probably be an employee that knows the product well. So it could be someone from sales. It could be a developer who helped develop it. It could be a user of it. It doesn't really matter. And then they would have some background in usability as well. If it's in academia, then yeah, you would try and find someone. You can also do it with more than one person. These things work. So I said one person, but you might use two. And there you might have one person who knows usability and one person that knows the system. So it would just be like they have a research background in the system. They would know something about what they're studying. Yeah. All right, so methodology. So the one we'll study is called a cognitive walkthrough. Okay, so before cognitive walkthrough, I'll tell you the approach that was suggested earlier, but it didn't really work. It's called heuristic evaluation. And basically what it meant is you would, like, I'll put it in terms of software because it was developed for software, but once again, you can use it for more than software. In heuristic evaluation, you would just like look at every button and you'd say, okay, what does this button do? When's the user going to use it? Do I think they know what it would do? You know, does the icon like look like what it's supposed to look like? They might go through every menu option and look at every menu. So it's a real like top to bottom look at every aspect of the user design or the user interface of software. Okay, so that's heuristic evaluation. Cognitive walkthrough says heuristic evaluation is kind of a waste of time. Most users have a task that they want to do. And so instead of studying every nook and cranny of the entire user interface, why don't we take a more task-oriented approach? So we're going to say, I'm pretending I'm a user and I want to do some basic task, right? Like I want to open a document and copy and paste some text into it, which you will not do on your project reports. So then I'm going to basically walk through that procedure. Okay, I'll try it. I'll see what the right procedure is. I'll see where I think users might go wrong. And I'm going to impose some structure on it so that it's not just a free-for-all in terms of what you're doing. But anyways, the core idea of a cognitive walkthrough, why it's called a walkthrough, is you have an expert. They're going to pretend to be a user. You define a set of core tasks. To be evaluated. So you're not worried about every button in the user interface. All you're saying is at the end of the day, do I think a user could do this core task or not? Or what do I think are the problems or the pitfalls that a user will do if they try and do this core task? So a core task is kind of like the most common. Well, at least you definitely want to start there, but then later, if you want really good usability, you might look at less common tasks. But you're going to start with the most common tasks. All right, so start with the most common tasks. And then in order to give you some structure, what you're going to do is you're going to have a set of guidelines that should always be true as you're walking through this task, okay? So that sounds kind of vague. I'll give you examples. So you define a set of guidelines, or heuristics they're sometimes called. That define what you expect from the usability of the system. Okay, so for example, like the user always knows what the next step is. So the user has some goal and they can figure out what they should do next. Maybe the user can recover from any error. So let's say they make a mistake, then they can recover. Maybe you want to be stricter, like a user will never commit an error. Other things like user knows the status at all times. So they're trying to do a task Do they know whether they've successfully done it or not? Do they know that they're halfway through? Do they know, do they know what the next step is? So, like I said, does the user interface guide them? Does the user interface use a lot of jargon so they don't understand what it means, technical terms and things like that? So I'll show you, we'll do a toy example of a cognitive walkthrough next class, and I'll show you a set of actual concrete guidelines. Okay, so now you have your set of core tasks, you have your set of guidelines. Now you're going to basically just walk through the core task. Pretend to be the user doing the core task, and then you're always going to check in with the guidelines to see how you're doing. Okay, and then you're going to say something like, okay, so I did this small, like you won't describe the whole step at once, right? The step will be broken up. The core task will be broken up into smaller steps, but you'll be like, okay, now the user wants to do this step, right? This is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing that probably the user can figure out what to do next, but if they make a mistake, they can't recover from it, so I'm going to flag that. But I don't think they'll commit a dangerous error, and there's no jargon that's used in this screen and blah, 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 right? So you basically, for all the guidelines, you say both it's good in terms of this guideline or it's bad in terms of this guideline. So you flag, and then you want to pay most attention, obviously, to things that you flag that are where it doesn't match the guidelines. Okay, and you're not thinking of a single user, you're thinking of kind of a spectrum of users. So you might think like, well, 80% of the users, you don't have to put numbers on it, but you're thinking in your mind like most users will probably be able to navigate this, but there'll be some of them that won't be able to navigate it. And you might think just sort of generally like if lots of users can go through, or what kind of expertise would the user need in order to make the right decision about this. And your job isn't necessarily to solve all the problems as the person doing the evaluation. It's just to sort of raise the issues, hand it off to the developers or whoever, the manager, and then they can decide about what to do about these types of things. Okay, so just a quick recap. So generally, a field study is better in terms of usability than a user study. And in terms of usability outcomes, like how certain you are, it's better than an expert review. So this is in terms of usability outcomes. Or maybe a better way of putting it is your confidence in the result. Okay, and then the other thing is that people often use more than one. So you don't have to choose between them. You can do all of them. Okay, so it's right? So almost everyone who does a user study did some sort of expert review first, right? Like you have to at least think, you have to put yourselves in the shoes of your users before you decide what you're testing and what your hypothesis is, right? So you might like do the expert review, 50 times, trying out different things. and then you do a user study. And then you look at the user study and you see the results and you see, oh, there's something interesting there, but it's not quite significant, or I asked the wrong question. I'd have to ask it, or I'd have to really look into this. I'd have to get them to do something a little different in order to really understand like what the difference is that I'm seeing here. So then you might play around with an expert review another couple times. So you might do this another 10 times. And then you might do another follow-up study. And now you're really happy, your results look good, and then you might try a field study. Or you might just publish at that point, depending on what sort of environment you're in or whatever. Okay? So anyways, expert review, quickest, easiest to do, but the least robust results. User studies are kind of hard to do, but you get better results. Field studies are really hard to do, but you get really good results. Okay? So you just sort of walk through them. Okay, so next class what we'll do is we'll do an actual cognitive walkthrough. I'm going to do it on Tor. It's something I studied a long time ago, and so every year I just try to do it to see how Tor's improved in terms of their usability. And so I'll show you the core tasks, I'll show you the guidelines, and then we'll actually, we won't spend forever doing it, but we'll install it and start to use it and try and actually do it. All right, so I'll see you all next week.